On November 25th, 1177, a dying 16-year-old king with bandaged hands rode into battle with 500 knights. Facing him were 26,000 of Islam's finest warriors. By sunset, the most powerful Muslim army in the world had been destroyed. Those numbers matter. 500 against 26,000. A 52-1 disadvantage. This was not a minor engagement. This was not a desperate skirmish on the edge of defeat. It was a decisive battlefield confrontation fought in open terrain, exactly the kind of battle medieval warfare was designed to make impossible for the smaller force to survive. The fate of Christian rule in the Holy Land rested on a margin so thin it barely existed. Yet by the end of that day, history recorded one of its most unlikely victories. To understand how this happened, 3 facts must be confronted. First, how did a teenage king suffering from advanced leprosy even remain conscious in battle, let alone command an army? Second, why did Saladin, the most successful Muslim commander of the age, make a single assumption that rendered his overwhelming numerical advantage meaningless? And third, what occurred in the critical hours when 26,000 disciplined warriors broke before an enemy they outnumbered more than 50-1? This is not a story about chance. It is a story about systems failing under conditions they were never designed to face. It is the story of a king whose body was collapsing and an army whose confidence collapsed faster. To understand how 500 men shattered an empire's might, we must begin with the moment when Jerusalem itself was preparing for extinction. By the year 1177, the Crusader kingdoms were reaching collapse. For nearly 8 decades, Christian rule in the Holy Land had survived through a fragile network of castles, alliances, and constant compromise. That system was now breaking apart. Fortress after fortress was falling. Garrisons were being overwhelmed or abandoning their posts entirely. Territories once considered secure were disappearing in a matter of months. The reason was not incompetence. The reason was unity. For the first time since the early caliphates, the Islamic world in the region had consolidated under a single commander. Saladin had united Egypt and Syria, creating the most powerful Muslim state the Crusaders had ever faced. With that unity came overwhelming resources: manpower, funding, logistics, and strategic depth. Saladin's armies had crushed every force sent against them. His reputation alone emptied castles without a fight. Frankish field armies could no longer afford open battle. Even victories drained manpower the kingdom could not replace. The kingdom of Jerusalem was running out of time. Its total military strength, scattered across dozens of fortifications, barely reached 15,000 men. Saladin commanded more than 100,000 across his domains, with 26,000 prepared for immediate campaign. The wealth of Egypt funded endless operations. The Crusaders had no such reserve. Jerusalem itself was exposed. Its walls were strong, its garrison was not. Fewer than 1,000 men stood between the city and annihilation. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Once Saladin moved, the city could not hold. Inside Jerusalem, the ruling elite understood this. Preparations were already underway, not for victory, but for survival. Ships waited in port. Exile routes were discussed in private. Quiet negotiations began with the expectation of eventual surrender. The smart money said the kingdom had months, possibly weeks. And at the center of this collapsing world sat a king who was not expected to survive the year. Baldwin IV had been crowned king at the age of 13. By 16, his body was failing. Leprosy was not simply an illness in the medieval world. It was a sentence. The disease stripped away sensation, strength, and dignity in slow stages. Baldwin's hands were already damaged beyond repair. Wrapped in silk bandages, they could barely close around a sword. His face, ravaged by infection, was concealed behind a silver mask. Courtiers whispered that God had cursed him. They were wrong. The disease destroyed Baldwin's body, but it did not touch his mind. Despite constant pain, Baldwin ruled with clarity. Chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, remarked on his memory, his judgment, and his ability to grasp reality without illusion. He understood what others avoided admitting. The kingdom could not survive a prolonged war. Every decision Baldwin made was shaped by one fact. He was racing his own body. Each campaign might be his last. Each victory would be purchased with pain no healthy man could endure. Walking had become agony. Riding required assistance. In councils of war, Baldwin was often carried on a litter, unable to stand. Yet, when intelligence reports arrived in the autumn of 1177, Baldwin did not hesitate. Saladin was assembling the largest army of his career. 26,000 mounted warriors, including his elite Mamluk cavalry, soldiers trained from childhood, veterans of continuous warfare. Their destination was obvious: Jerusalem. The city's defenders could not stop them. Waiting behind the walls meant slow death by siege, starvation, and eventual surrender. Baldwin understood this before anyone else. And he understood something more. If the kingdom was going to fall, it would not fall quietly. Facing Baldwin stood Saladin. At 40 years old, Saladin was at the height of his power. He had unified Egypt and Syria, forged a disciplined professional army, and built a reputation that made resistance seem pointless. His campaigns had been methodical, relentless, and successful. No field army sent against him had survived intact. Saladin was not reckless. He was not impulsive. His strength came from planning, logistics, and patience. He understood supply lines. He understood morale. He understood when to fight and when to wait. And by late 1177, everything favored him. His domains stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. Egypt's wealth funded continuous warfare. His commanders were experienced. His troops, particularly the Mamluk cavalry, were trained from childhood and hardened by years of campaigning. The army he assembled that autumn was the largest of his career. 26,000 mounted warriors moved north with confidence. Muslim chroniclers described it as an ocean of steel and faith. The supply train alone stretched for miles, a visible declaration that this was not a raid or a punitive expedition. It was conquest. Saladin's objective was clear. Jerusalem's defenses were thin. Its field armies were scattered. Once the city fell, Christian rule in the Holy Land would collapse with it. Within Saladin's camp, the outcome was not seriously questioned. Emirs discussed how conquered lands would be divided. The campaign was expected to be decisive and final. There was only one assumption underlying every plan: Baldwin would remain behind Jerusalem's walls. Inside Jerusalem, Baldwin faced the same calculations and reached a different conclusion. His advisors urged caution. They begged him to withdraw. A 16-year-old king with advanced leprosy had no place leading a last stand. The walls were strong. The city could hold, at least temporarily. Baldwin understood what they were saying. He also understood what they were not saying. Jerusalem could not survive a siege. Time favored Saladin, not the defenders. Every day behind the walls would weaken the garrison and strengthen the enemy. Waiting was not safety. It was delay. Baldwin chose to act. He ordered the kingdom's remaining field forces to assemble. 500 knights answered the call. Among them were 80 Knights Templar, warrior monks bound by vows to never retreat and never surrender. Supporting them were roughly 3,000 infantry, many of them local levies with limited training. Against them stood 26,000 mounted warriors. The disparity was obvious. No commander in his position would have sought open battle. Baldwin did. Despite hands so damaged he required assistance to put on armor, he insisted on leading the army himself. He was lifted onto his horse. His body was strapped to the saddle because his legs could no longer grip. Witnesses recorded that Templars wept as they watched their king prepare to ride. Before departing, Baldwin addressed his men. He did not promise survival. He did not promise victory. He told them that if they achieved the impossible, no man could claim it had been done by human strength alone. Then the gates of Jerusalem opened. The army rode out. Saladin never expected a field battle. Every calculation he made pointed to the same conclusion. Jerusalem would stay behind its walls. Baldwin would wait. The Crusader forces were too weak, too scattered, and too outmatched to risk open ground. That assumption shaped everything that followed. On November 23rd, Saladin bypassed the fortress of Ascalon. It was a deliberate choice. A siege would slow the advance. Jerusalem lay exposed, and speed mattered more than caution. There was no reason to secure the rear when no serious resistance was expected. As the army moved north, discipline loosened. Foraging parties spread across the countryside. Units operated independently. Supply lines stretched forward without tight protection. The army was not deployed for battle. It was deployed for occupation. The terrain around Montgisard appeared ideal. Rolling plains, open ground, space for cavalry to maneuver. Every principle of medieval warfare favored the larger force. In open battle, numbers decided outcomes. Saladin had never seen that rule fail. What Saladin did not see was the ground itself. From a distance, the plains looked uninterrupted. In reality, the land was cut by shallow ravines, natural channels invisible until approached closely. They did not matter to an army in formation. They mattered enormously to an army caught off balance. Saladin assumed there would be time to organize. He was wrong. While Saladin's army advanced in confidence, Baldwin moved in silence. On November 24th, the Crusader force left Jerusalem. Their objective was not defense. It was contact. Baldwin understood that the only chance of survival lay in striking Saladin's army before it could concentrate. The march that followed was brutal. 45 miles in 36 hours, an impossible pace for healthy men. Torture for a king whose body was already failing. When Baldwin lost consciousness from pain, Templars carried his litter. When he regained awareness, he insisted on continuing. By dawn on November 25th, the Crusader force was exhausted. Horses foamed at the mouth. Men swayed in their saddles. No one expected what came next. The scouts returned with decisive news. Saladin's army was spread across 3 miles of countryside. Units were scattered. Guards were thin. The army was not in battle formation. It was vulnerable. The report also brought worse news. The enemy numbers were larger than expected. Not 20,000, but 26,000 warriors. Banners stretched to the horizon. The arithmetic was worse than anyone had imagined. Some of Baldwin's knights openly despaired. Others prayed. The situation defied reason. Then Baldwin made his final preparation. Despite agony that would have broken most men, he demanded to be lifted from his litter and placed on his horse. Addressing his commanders, he did not speak of tactics. He spoke of resolve. David had faced Goliath with faith. They would face 26,000 the same way. The decision was made. They would attack. At 11 in the morning, Saladin received his first warning. Dust clouds to the north. Movement. Fast. The report made no sense. Baldwin would not leave Jerusalem's walls. At most, this was a scouting force. Nothing that required immediate concern. Saladin dismissed it. By noon, the truth could no longer be ignored. Crusader banners appeared on the ridgeline. The red cross of the Templars. The gold of Jerusalem. Not scouts. Not a feint. An army, small, exhausted, and advancing directly toward the center of Saladin's scattered force. Orders were shouted. Messengers rode hard. Units began scrambling to reform. But the army was stretched across miles of countryside. There was no single line to restore, no instant cohesion to recover. Time was the one resource Saladin no longer had. Baldwin waited. He did not attack immediately. He allowed confusion to grow. He allowed Saladin's commanders to realize what they were facing without giving them space to respond. Then, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Baldwin raised his bandaged hand. It was the signal. 500 lances dropped into position. There would be no retreat, no probing charge, no attempt to disengage if the attack failed. The Crusader force accelerated straight into the heart of the enemy. The charge began at full gallop. 500 armored horsemen crossed 300 yards in under a minute. Their battle cry, Deus Vult, cut through the noise of panicked commands and reforming units. The ground shook under the weight of iron and flesh. At the spear point rode the Templar. 80 knights formed into a wedge, a human weapon designed to split formations rather than break on impact. Their target was Saladin's center, still forming, still disorganized, still trying to become an army. Muslim archers released volleys as the Crusaders closed the distance. Arrows fell like rain. Knights went down, horses screamed, and collapsed. The charge did not slow. At 200 yards, the reality of what was happening became impossible to ignore. This was not a demonstration. This was not desperation. It was an assault meant to destroy. At 100 yards, the front ranks of Saladin's cavalry hesitated. Horses sensed what riders could not yet accept. Formation began to loosen. Then the impact came. The Templar wedge smashed into the half-formed center at full speed. Lances shattered. Men and horses were crushed together. In the first seconds alone, hundreds of Mamluks were killed or thrown beneath hooves. But the shock was not the collision. The shock was what followed. Instead of withdrawing after the initial strike, the Templars drove deeper, cutting through the center like a blade seeking the heart. Behind them, Baldwin's remaining knights surged forward, expanding the breach. At that moment, the battle crossed a line it could not return from. Saladin's center began to buckle. Not retreat. Buckle. Once Saladin's center buckled, the battle changed character. This was no longer a contest of strength. It became a psychological collapse. Units on the flanks saw the center folding and hesitated. That hesitation spread faster than orders could correct it. Riders slowed. Formations loosened. Gaps appeared where discipline should have held. Horses sensed disorder and resisted commands. War horses trained for formation combat began backing away from the pressure. In a cavalry battle, that alone was lethal. Then Baldwin committed his final reserve. 3,000 infantry, previously hidden by folds in the ground, emerged on Saladin's flank. They were not elite troops. They did not need to be. Their sudden appearance shattered the remaining coherence of the Muslim line. To soldiers already uncertain, it appeared that Crusader forces were materializing from nowhere. The word spread instantly. Surrounded. It was not true in a tactical sense. It was decisive in a psychological one. Once panic entered the formation, command ceased to function. Orders could no longer travel faster than fear. Individual survival replaced collective discipline. Riders began turning away from the pressure, not retreating by design, but fleeing by instinct. At that moment, 26,000 men were no longer an army. They were a crowd in motion. This was where Baldwin's understanding of the terrain became decisive. As Saladin's forces attempted to escape, they moved into what appeared to be open ground. From a distance, the plains around Montgisard offered clear paths away from the battle. Up close, they did not. The land was cut by shallow ravines, dry channels that broke the surface into narrow corridors. Men fleeing at speed did not see them until it was too late. Horses stumbled, riders collided, units compressed into bottlenecks with no room to maneuver. What had looked like avenues of escape became killing grounds. Crusader knights pursued directly into these channels. There was no formation left to resist them. Men fell on top of one another. Horses broke legs and collapsed. Those behind trampled the wounded in desperate attempts to get through. The ravines filled with bodies. In several places, the dead piled so densely that they formed bridges of flesh across the channels. Others suffocated beneath the weight of fleeing comrades before a blade ever reached them. This was no longer battle. It was annihilation driven by momentum, terrain, and panic. By late afternoon, Saladin's army was no longer retreating. It was dissolving. By mid-afternoon, Saladin could see the truth from his command position. His center was gone. His flanks were breaking. His army was no longer responding as a single force. Saladin attempted to reassert control. Orders were shouted. Messengers rode out. None returned with results. The noise of panic drowned out command. The collapse had moved faster than any countermeasure could. Then the final rupture occurred. Saladin's personal guard, 2,000 Mamluk cavalry sworn to die before abandoning their commander, began to withdraw. These were not inexperienced soldiers. They were veterans who had faced Byzantine heavy cavalry and Nubian forces without hesitation. Yet now they broke. The sight was decisive. Once the Sultan's guard faltered, the remaining resistance evaporated. What discipline remained dissolved in seconds. Saladin made a calculation no commander wanted to face. His horse was too slow. To escape, he abandoned it and mounted a racing camel. The image mattered. In medieval warfare, symbols carried weight. A ruler who fled on a pack animal did not inspire confidence. He confirmed defeat. As Saladin disappeared from the field, pursuit intensified. Crusader knights chased fleeing units for miles. There was no organized resistance left to slow them. By 3:30 in the afternoon, the battle was over. What remained was destruction. The numbers recorded afterwards stunned even contemporaries. Of the 26,000 warriors who entered the field that morning, fewer than 2,000 escaped. More than 20,000 lay dead. Muslim chroniclers described the outcome not as defeat, but as catastrophe. The ravines around Montgisard became mass graves. Bodies filled them layer upon layer. In some places, the dead lay so thick that horses were forced to step carefully, as if walking across uneven ground. The Crusader losses were severe. Over 1,000 dead from a force of fewer than 4,000 engaged. But compared to the destruction inflicted, they were insignificant. This was not a reversal. It was annihilation. The scale of the disaster shattered assumptions across the region. An army believed to be invincible had been erased in a single afternoon by a force outnumbered more than 50 to 1. Muslim chroniclers struggled to explain it. Some called it divine punishment. Others admitted that morale had failed where numbers could not compensate. By sunset on November 25th, 1177, the field of Montgisard told a story no strategist expected to read. 500 men had destroyed an empire's greatest army, and nothing in the Holy Land would be the same again. The immediate consequences of the victory were staggering. Saladin's army had carried with it the material foundation for a long campaign. Weapons, armor, horses, gold, supplies, everything required to sustain 26,000 men in hostile territory. In less than 3 hours, it all fell into Crusader hands. The scale of the capture defied calculation. Chroniclers recorded enough weapons to equip multiple armies. Thousands of horses, including prized Arabian mounts, were seized. Saladin's war chest, intended to pay his soldiers and secure loyalty, was taken intact. In a single afternoon, the Kingdom of Jerusalem went from bankruptcy to solvency. The economic impact alone altered the balance of power. Fortresses that had been preparing for abandonment could now be reinforced. Garrisons could be paid, supplies could be stockpiled. The victory did not make the kingdom strong, but it kept it alive. Across the Muslim world, the shock was immediate. Saladin returned south with fewer than 2,000 survivors. The man who had never known defeat arrived humiliated. Emirs who had been dividing conquered land days earlier now questioned his judgment. Confidence fractured where certainty had existed. A contemporary Muslim chronicler described the battle as the most terrible catastrophe to befall Islam in this age. The myth of inevitability had been broken. For Baldwin IV, the victory came at a price his body could barely afford. Once the fighting ended, the strain caught up with him. Strapped to his saddle throughout the battle, unable to feel his hands, he had pushed his body beyond its limits. Witnesses reported that blood seeped through his bandages as reopened wounds failed to close. When Baldwin was finally lifted from his horse, he collapsed. Physicians warned that he might not survive the night. The effort of command, the pain of battle, and the physical trauma had accelerated the disease consuming him. What the army had survived, his body nearly did not. Yet Baldwin endured. On the field itself, surrounded by corpses, he insisted on one final act. The surviving knights knelt, bloodied and exhausted, and prayed. Not in celebration, in acknowledgement. The victory had not cured Baldwin. It had not saved him. It had only bought time. Time for the kingdom. Time he himself did not have. Montgisard did not end the war. It changed how the war was fought. In the years that followed, Saladin rebuilt. He retained his territories. He retained his political position. But something fundamental had shifted. The man who had advanced with confidence now advanced with caution. For nearly a decade after Montgisard, Saladin avoided decisive engagements with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Campaigns became slower. Probes replaced sweeping offensives. Sieges were planned with greater care. The memory of a scattered army destroyed in a single afternoon lingered. Military historians estimate that it took Saladin close to 10 years to rebuild a force comparable to what he lost in 3 hours. For the Crusader states, the victory bought time. Nothing more. Jerusalem did not become secure. Demographics did not change. The strategic imbalance remained. But the kingdom survived. Fortresses held. Borders stabilized. Diplomacy regained leverage. All of it rested on one fact. Montgisard delayed the inevitable. Baldwin IV continued to rule for 8 more years. His body deteriorated steadily. He lost his sight. He lost the ability to walk. But his authority did not diminish. Even Saladin, years later, would reportedly say that Baldwin was the man he feared most. When Baldwin died in 1185 at the age of 24, the protection he had provided vanished with him. 2 years later, Jerusalem fell. Montgisard stands apart in military history, not because of tactics alone, not because of faith alone, not because of leadership alone. It stands apart because it violated expectation at every level. 500 men defeated 26,000 not because they were stronger, but because they struck a system at the moment it was most vulnerable. Saladin's army did not fail due to incompetence. It failed because its assumptions collapsed under pressure. Numbers did not save it. Experience did not save it. Discipline did not save it. Morale broke first. Both Christian and Muslim chroniclers reached the same conclusion through different language. Something extraordinary had occurred. Some called it divine intervention, others called it catastrophe. Modern military analysis offers a simpler explanation. In battle, belief can outweigh arithmetic. Briefly, Baldwin IV understood that truth. His genius was not tactical innovation, it was conviction. He made his men believe that retreat was impossible and victory unavoidable. Once that belief took hold, the outcome followed. Montgisard was the last great Crusader victory in the Holy Land. The final moment when Christian knights dominated a major battlefield in the region. After it, numbers would again decide outcomes. That is what makes the battle endure. It was not a turning point. It was an exception, a moment when history bent, then snapped back into place. 500 men held the line against the tide of history, and for one afternoon, they won.